December 21st, 1944. The frozen hills of Belgium echoed with the thunder of American artillery as German forces prepared for what they believed would be their final breakthrough. What the Germans didn't know was that they were about to encounter an innovation so simple, so overlooked, that it would fundamentally change the nature of warfare forever. This wasn't some massive technological breakthrough. It wasn't a secret weapon developed in hidden laboratories. It was a wooden ruler that would make German commanders fear every single grid square on their maps. The story begins not in the heat of battle, but in a quiet classroom at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where a frustrated National Guard captain was about to solve a problem that had plagued artillery officers since the invention of gunpowder. His name was Abbott Harrington Burns, and he absolutely despised horses. This hatred of cavalry duties had led him to request a transfer to field artillery, a decision that would accidentally revolutionize modern warfare. Burns had spent weeks learning the traditional method of artillery calculation, and it was driving him insane. Every fire mission required officers to flip through 76 pages of dense mathematical tables, cross-referencing ranges with elevations, calculating corrections for wind and weather, interpolating between values when targets fell at odd distances. The process took 3 to 5 minutes per battery. In combat, 3 minutes was an eternity. 3 minutes meant the difference between catching enemy forces in the open and hitting empty dirt. But here's what made this problem truly maddening. The mathematics weren't wrong. The ballistics calculations were sound. The firing tables contained accurate data derived from extensive testing. The problem was purely mechanical. Finding the right numbers in those tables was like trying to locate a specific sentence in a phone book while someone was shooting at you. No amount of training could make human fingers flip pages faster than physically possible. Burns understood something that most artillery officers missed. This wasn't really a mathematics problem. It was an engineering problem, and engineering problems could be solved through better design. He had studied engineering at West Point before leaving the army for civilian construction work. He knew that when you had a recurring calculation following the same pattern every time, you could build a mechanical device to do it faster than manual methods. That's when Burns had his breakthrough moment. Slide rules, which every engineer carried, were exactly that kind of device. Mechanical computers that performed multiplication and division by sliding logarithmic scales past each other. But standard slide rules use logarithmic scales designed for general mathematical operations. Artillery calculations required something different, something specific to the relationships between range, elevation, and charge, so Burns did what frustrated engineers do. He stayed late one evening in November 1940, cleared off a desk in an empty classroom and started sketching. He worked with firing tables, graph paper, a ruler, and a pencil. His goal was simple: create a device that would let him read artillery data directly instead of searching through pages. He worked for about 2 hours that first evening, and by the end, he had a workable concept. The breakthrough came when Burns realized he didn't need to represent every piece of data in those 76 pages. He only needed to represent the relationships between the key variables. If he created a linear scale for range and positioned it correctly, relative to a scale for elevation, he could set a cursor to any range and directly read the corresponding elevation. No table searching required, no page flipping, no interpolation calculations. The next evening, Burns returned to that empty classroom and refined his design. He added scales for fuse settings and drift corrections. He experimented with different layouts to maximize readability. By the end of his second session, he had detailed sketches for what would become known as the graphical firing table. A wooden base about 10 inches long with multiple scales printed on both sides, a clear plastic cursor sliding along the base, with a precise hairline for reading exact values. Burns built his first prototype using materials scrounged from the Fort Sill training facility. A strip of wood from a shipping crate, paper scales carefully drawn and glued down, a piece of clear acetate for the cursor with a line scratched across it. The result looked like something a high school shop class might produce, but it worked perfectly. Burns tested his contraption against problems from the official firing tables, set the cursor to a range, read the elevation, check against the table value. Perfect match every time. The calculation that previously took 3 to 5 minutes now took about 20 seconds. 20 seconds versus 3 minutes. That wasn't just an improvement, that was a revolution. But when Burns showed his prototype to other officers in the fire direction course, most reactions range from polite disinterest to active hostility. These were officers trained on traditional tabular methods. They were comfortable with the established system. They saw no reason to learn something new, especially something that looked like a homemade gadget built from scrap materials. Some suggested Burns was wasting time on gimmicks, instead of mastering proper procedures. This resistance wasn't surprising. Military institutions are inherently conservative. Procedures that work get institutionalized. Change is viewed with suspicion, particularly change that comes from junior officers challenging established doctrine. Burns was proposing to replace a system that had worked adequately for decades with something he'd sketched on graph paper and assembled from spare parts. But one officer recognized the revolutionary potential immediately. Major George Kaiser was an instructor at Fort Sill who had been teaching fire direction for over a year. He had watched hundreds of students struggle with tabular calculations. He understood exactly how much time officers wasted searching through those 76 pages during the pressure of combat situations. When Burns demonstrated his graphical firing table, Kaiser saw beyond the crude prototype to the tactical implications. This device could reduce calculation time by more than 90%. That meant fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries simultaneously. That meant achieving something artillery officers had dreamed about since the First World War: true simultaneous impact from batteries at different distances. Kaiser convinced Burns to abandon his plans for civilian employment and stay at Fort Sill to develop the graphical firing table into a production device. This decision would prove crucial because the innovation needed an advocate with the rank and institutional position to navigate army bureaucracy. Burns had the engineering insight, but Kaiser had the military credibility to get the device officially adopted. The refinement process took months. Burns and Kaiser smoothed out design problems, adapted the device for different weapon systems and ammunition types, and tested it extensively under various conditions. Artillery officers who learned to use the graphical firing table could calculate firing data more than 20 times faster than traditional methods. Even better, enlisted men with basic arithmetic skills could perform calculations that previously required officers with engineering degrees. But speed was only half the innovation. The real breakthrough came from understanding what that speed enabled tactically. Traditional artillery doctrine called for batteries to engage targets sequentially. One battery fires, observers adjust, another battery fires, adjust again. This method worked, but it gave enemies time to react. Time to see the first shells land, time to scatter, time to take cover, time to survive. Experienced German infantry had learned to disperse from formations in under 15 seconds once they heard incoming rounds. By the time a second battery fired at the same target, most German soldiers had moved to cover. Artillery was still effective, but nowhere near as devastating as it could be if all shells arrived simultaneously. This was where the graphical firing table created tactical possibilities that hadn't existed before. With calculation speeds reduced from minutes to seconds, fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries for time-on-target missions. Batteries closer to the target would fire later. Batteries farther away would fire first. Each battery calculated their own shell flight time and adjusted their firing moment so all rounds impacted within a 3-second window. The psychological and physical effects were devastating. Instead of shells arriving in sequence over several minutes, giving defenders time to react, all shells arrived at once. No warning, no time to take cover. Maximum casualties inflicted in those crucial first seconds when troops were still in the open, still in formation, still vulnerable. This technique had been theoretically possible before the war, but practically impossible with traditional calculation methods. The mathematics required for precise time-on-target coordination were too complex to perform quickly enough during combat. Fire direction centers using tabular methods simply couldn't calculate and communicate firing data fast enough to achieve true simultaneous impact from multiple batteries. The graphical firing table eliminated that mathematical bottleneck entirely. Fire direction crews could now determine exactly when each battery needed to fire, so shells with different flight times would all arrive together. This calculation, which previously took too long to be combat practical, could now be completed in under a minute for multiple batteries. By 1944, thousands of graphical firing tables had been manufactured and distributed to American artillery units in both Europe and the Pacific. The device was elegant in its simplicity. A 10-inch wooden ruler with scales printed on both sides, different scales for different ammunition types and weapons, a sliding cursor with an engraved hairline for precise readings. Everything needed for a fire mission could be read in seconds instead of minutes. But the device was only as revolutionary as the doctrine that employed it. Having one battery calculate data quickly meant nothing if other batteries still used slow traditional methods. The real tactical advantage came from combining graphical firing tables with coordinated time-on-target techniques across multiple batteries simultaneously. This coordination became the key to American artillery superiority. Forward observers could call for fire from any battery in range, regardless of which division that battery belonged to. Fire direction centers treated all artillery as general support rather than rigidly allocating guns to specific units. A single observer could request simultaneous fire from batteries miles apart, all coordinated through rapid calculation methods that made precise timing possible. The stage was now set for the ultimate test of this innovation. In December 1944, German forces would launch their largest offensive of the war, throwing over 200,000 troops against American positions in the Ardennes. They would encounter defensive firepower organized and coordinated in ways that had never been possible before in military history. What happened next would demonstrate that sometimes the smallest innovations create the largest tactical advantages. A wooden slide rule was about to change the outcome of the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army D States Army. The German offensive began at precisely 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, with the most concentrated artillery bombardment the Wehrmacht had unleashed since the opening of Operation Barbarossa. Over 1,000 German guns pounded American positions across a 50-mile front for 90 minutes straight. The earth shook, trees splintered, foxholes collapsed. But when the barrage lifted and German infantry emerged from the Eifel Mountains, they were advancing into a trap that had been mathematically calculated with wooden slide rules. Brigadier General John Hamilton Hines stood at his command post near Elsenborn Ridge, coordinating what would become the most devastating display of artillery coordination in American military history. Hines commanded not just his own division's guns, but artillery from 4 separate divisions, 348 pieces total, 16 battalions of howitzers, 6 battalions of corps-level heavy artillery, every single battery equipped with graphical firing tables, every fire direction center capable of calculating data in 20 seconds instead of 3 minutes. But numbers alone don't win artillery duels. Coordination does, and coordination requires speed. Speed of calculation, speed of communication, speed of response. The Germans had more guns in their initial bombardment, but they were operating under the constraints of traditional fire direction methods. Their batteries fired pre-planned concentrations calculated hours or days in advance. Once those fire plans were set, German artillery couldn't adjust quickly to changing tactical situations. American artillery at Elsenborn operated on completely different principles. Forward observers identified targets in real time. Fire direction centers calculated fresh data for each mission using graphical firing tables. Batteries could shift from one target to another in under 2 minutes. The entire system emphasized flexibility and responsiveness over detailed pre-planning. This matched perfectly with the fluid nature of defensive operations, where targets couldn't be predicted in advance. The 99th Infantry Division held the forward positions below the ridge. They were green troops, barely 2 months in combat, stretched thin across terrain their commanders had considered too rugged for major German offensive operations. That assessment proved catastrophically wrong when the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth and supporting Volksgrenadier units came streaming out of the morning fog in overwhelming strength. American infantry fought far better than anyone expected. Small unit leaders made good tactical decisions under pressure. Soldiers who had never seen serious combat held positions against overwhelming odds. But they couldn't hold indefinitely against entire German divisions. The key was buying time for artillery coordination to develop its full potential. That coordination began to manifest on December the 17th, when German forces made their first major push toward the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rochereth. German commanders expected quick penetration followed by rapid exploitation toward the Meuse River. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented in their military experience. Forward observers with American infantry companies called for artillery support as German formations advanced. Multiple fire direction centers calculated firing data simultaneously using their graphical firing tables. Batteries at different distances from the target area adjusted their firing times to achieve time-on-target impact. When German infantry emerged from the tree line in battalion strength, expecting to overwhelm isolated American defenders, they walked into a mathematical precision that defied their understanding of artillery warfare. The first time-on-target mission delivered by Heinz's coordinated batteries caught an entire German regiment in the open. Hundreds of artillery shells arrived within seconds of each other. High explosive rounds, time-fused rounds set to detonate 15 feet above ground, spraying shrapnel across wide areas. White phosphorus rounds creating smoke screens and incendiary effects. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. German soldiers who survived described the experience in terms that revealed how fundamentally different this was from artillery they had previously encountered. Traditional artillery gave warning. You heard the first shells incoming. You had time to react, time to disperse, time to take cover. At Elsenborn, there were no first shells. All shells landed simultaneously. By the time German soldiers realized they were under fire, they were already casualties. This wasn't just more artillery. This was artillery employed in ways that violated every assumption German tactical doctrine was based on. Wehrmacht training manuals taught soldiers to scatter when they heard incoming rounds. That technique, developed through years of combat experience, became useless when all rounds arrived at once with no advance warning. German officers tried to adapt. They ordered their troops to advance in more dispersed formations. They attempted to coordinate their own artillery to suppress American positions before infantry attacks. They shifted to night operations when observation was more difficult. None of these adaptations worked because they were addressing symptoms rather than the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem was that American artillery could respond faster than German forces could react. Forward observers called targets. Fire direction centers calculated data in seconds. Batteries delivered coordinated fires within minutes. By the time German commanders identified American positions and organized countermeasures, American artillery had already shifted to new targets or displaced to new positions. December 19th marked the first time Heinz demonstrated the full potential of his coordinated system. German forces made 3 separate attacks on American positions that day. All 3 attacks were crushed by artillery fire before they could develop into serious threats. One fire mission against German assembly areas delivered over 5,000 rounds in 20 minutes. German prisoners later reported that the bombardment was unlike anything they had experienced on the Eastern Front in North Africa or in Italy. The comparison to Russian artillery was particularly telling. German veterans acknowledged that Soviet artillery could deliver heavier concentrations through massed batteries firing hundreds of guns simultaneously in pre-planned barrages. Russian artillery was a sledgehammer that could devastate entire sectors when properly employed. But Russian artillery lacked flexibility. Once a barrage plan was established, it couldn't be modified quickly for changing tactical situations. American artillery combined mass with responsiveness in ways German forces had never encountered. Individual American batteries weren't more powerful than German equivalents. The 105 mm howitzer, standard American divisional artillery, had similar range and shell weight to comparable German weapons. But American batteries could respond to calls for fire within minutes, shift targets rapidly, and coordinate with other batteries for concentrated effects. The speed advantage translated into tactical superiority at every level of engagement. German intelligence officers examined captured American positions trying to understand how fire direction centers could calculate and deliver fire so rapidly. They found standard equipment, standard procedures, standard communications gear, nothing obviously different from artillery they had captured elsewhere. What they never discovered was the graphical firing table itself. The device was small, easily overlooked among other fire direction center equipment. Even when captured intact, it might not be recognized as significant unless someone understood American artillery doctrine and calculation methods. It looked like a ruler with markings. Only an artillery specialist would realize it was the key to American fire superiority. This invisibility was crucial to the innovation's effectiveness. German forces couldn't counter what they couldn't see. They knew American artillery was responding faster and hitting harder, but they couldn't determine why. Traditional German solutions involved counter-battery fire, but American batteries were displacing too quickly to be effectively targeted. German commanders ordered more dispersed formations, but American time-on-target techniques were catching troops regardless of their spacing. By December 21st, The psychological impact on German soldiers was becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Elite SS troops who considered themselves superior to any opposition were questioning their ability to attack successfully. Units that had fought across Europe without doubting German military supremacy were experiencing something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about warfare. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth had been formed from fanatically motivated volunteers who viewed themselves as the military embodiment of Nazi ideology. They had expected to overwhelm American positions through superior training, equipment, and fighting spirit. Instead, they found themselves advancing into killing zones where every movement drew instant artillery response that arrived, without warning, and left no time for reaction. This erosion of confidence cascaded through German operations in ways that multiplied the tactical advantages American artillery had created. German infantry began hesitating before attacks, knowing they would face coordinated firepower they couldn't counter. German commanders started questioning attack plans that had seemed viable on paper, but proved suicidal when executed against responsive artillery systems. The failure at Elsenborn forced fundamental changes to the entire German offensive strategy. The original plan required the 6th SS Panzer Army to achieve breakthrough in the northern sector, seize the road network, and drive toward Antwerp. When that thrust stalled against American defensive firepower, Hitler redirected emphasis to the 5th Panzer Army in the centre, attacking through more difficult terrain with fewer roads and less favourable logistics. This strategic adjustment meant the German offensive lost cohesion and concentration, the very qualities that might have given it a chance of success. Instead of a focused thrust with clear objectives, German forces were spread across multiple axes without sufficient strength for decisive breakthrough anywhere. American artillery superiority had forced Germany's last mobile reserves into a battle of attrition they couldn't win. The innovation that enabled this outcome remained hidden in fire direction centre tents across the Ardennes. Wooden slide rules that looked like ordinary measuring devices but functioned as tactical multipliers that gave American artillery decisive advantages. The Germans never understood what they were fighting against, which made their defeat inevitable rather than merely probable. The mathematics of destruction were playing out across frozen Belgian hills with a precision that would have impressed any engineer. But the Germans facing this calculated devastation had no idea they were witnessing the practical application of a wooden slide rule invented by a man who hated horses. December 22nd brought the largest coordinated fire mission in American military history. German forces were massing for what they believed would be their decisive breakthrough. Intelligence reports indicated multiple divisions concentrating near the twin villages, preparing for a coordinated assault that would finally crack the American defensive line. What the Germans didn't realize was that their assembly areas had been plotted, calculated, and pre-registered by fire direction centers operating at speeds that defied traditional military mathematics. Heinz received the target intelligence at 600 hours. By 6:03, he had coordinated fire missions across 4 divisions. By 6:05, every battery under his command had calculated firing data using their graphical firing tables. By 06:07, the largest time-on-target strike ever attempted by American forces was ready for execution. The precision was staggering. Batteries positioned miles apart, firing different ammunition types, using various charge weights, all coordinated to deliver their shells within a 3-second window. At exactly 0800 hours, the sky above the German assembly areas erupted. 10,000 rounds arrived simultaneously, not sequentially, not in waves, all at once. The sound was unlike anything human beings had ever created. A single, massive detonation that lasted for 20 seconds as shells continued impacting in perfect synchronization. German soldiers who survived described it as the end of the world delivered with mechanical precision. The psychological impact transcended the physical destruction. German officers had trained their entire careers to understand artillery patterns. They knew how to read bombardments, how to predict where shells would fall next, how to time movements between salvos. None of that knowledge applied when facing time-on-target techniques. There were no patterns to read, no gaps to exploit, no safe moments between impacts. German commanders tried desperately to understand what had changed. They examined American prisoners, searched captured positions, analysed communication intercepts. Their intelligence officers produced detailed reports attempting to explain American artillery superiority. These reports identified better communications, superior observation networks, and more flexible command structures, all accurate observations, but none addressing the fundamental innovation that made everything else possible. The invisible revolution continued throughout the battle. Every German attack encountered the same devastating response. Forward observers called targets, fire direction centers calculated instantly, multiple batteries fired simultaneously. The pattern repeated with mathematical consistency that German forces couldn't disrupt because they couldn't identify its source. On December 23rd, the 12th SS Panzer Division made its final attempt to break through American lines. This was Germany's most elite armoured formation, equipped with the newest tanks, manned by fanatically motivated soldiers who had never accepted defeat. They attacked in regimental strength, supported by artillery, air support, and everything the Wehrmacht could provide. The attack lasted exactly 47 minutes. American artillery destroyed it completely, not through overwhelming firepower, but through coordinated firepower delivered faster than German forces could react. The elite SS division that had terrorized Europe was rendered combat ineffective by wooden slide rules, operated by American soldiers most Germans considered inferior. The tactical implications rippled across the entire Western Front. German commanders realized they had lost the ability to mass forces for offensive operations. Any concentration immediately drew coordinated artillery fire that arrived without warning. The initiative had shifted permanently to forces equipped with innovations their enemies couldn't see or understand, but the strategic implications were even more profound. Germany's last mobile reserves were being destroyed in a battle they had initiated to regain the offensive. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to split Allied forces, recapture Antwerp, and force negotiated peace. Instead, it was bleeding Germany's remaining strength against defensive systems that multiplied American firepower through superior coordination. The irony was perfect. German military doctrine emphasized technological superiority, advanced engineering, and scientific precision. They had developed sophisticated weapons, complex tactical systems, and elaborate organizational structures. They were being defeated by a device so simple that any carpenter could manufacture it, so basic that it resembled a child's toy, so obvious that its significance was invisible to military analysts. Burns's innovation had created what military theorists call a force multiplier. The same guns, operated by the same crews, firing the same ammunition, became exponentially more effective through improved coordination. This wasn't about having more artillery. This was about using existing artillery better. The difference between sequential fire and simultaneous fire wasn't incremental improvement. It was categorical transformation. The transformation was visible in casualty reports from German units that fought at Elsenborn. Traditional artillery caused steady attrition over extended periods. Soldiers learned to live with constant danger, developed survival techniques, adapted to artillery environments. Time-on-target strikes caused catastrophic casualties in concentrated bursts. Units lost 50% of their strength in single-fire missions. Survivors experienced psychological trauma that rendered them combat ineffective, even when physically unharmed. German medical reports documented something unprecedented in their military experience. Soldiers who hadn't been physically wounded were suffering nervous breakdowns from artillery encounters. Combat veterans who had survived years of fighting were requesting transfer away from sectors facing American artillery. The Wehrmacht's institutional confidence was being systematically destroyed by weapons that seemed to violate the laws of warfare itself. December 24th marked the effective end of German offensive capability in the northern sector. The 12th SS Panzer Division was withdrawn from the line, no longer combat effective. Supporting Volksgrenadier divisions had been shattered. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which was supposed to achieve decisive breakthrough, couldn't advance beyond the positions it had held on December 17th. The road network remained in American hands. The northern shoulder held completely. Hitler finally accepted reality and redirected the offensive toward Bastogne, where the 5th Panzer Army was making limited progress against different American forces. But even there, the pattern repeated. American artillery equipped with graphical firing tables and trained in time-on-target techniques consistently outperformed German artillery operating under traditional methods. Coordination speed translated into tactical superiority, regardless of terrain or local conditions. The battle was effectively decided, though fighting continued for weeks. German forces lacked the mobility to exploit any temporary advantages. American forces could concentrate firepower faster than Germans could concentrate attacks. The mathematical certainty of the outcome was evident to anyone who understood the calculation advantages American artillery possessed. By early January 1945, German forces were being pushed back toward their starting positions. The largest offensive in Wehrmacht history had achieved nothing except enormous casualties Germany couldn't afford. More critically, it had demonstrated that American military capabilities had evolved beyond German ability to counter them. The invisible innovation had created visible defeat. The implications extended far beyond the Ardennes. Every subsequent German defensive position would face the same coordinated firepower that had crushed their offensive at Elsenborn. Every attempt to concentrate forces for counterattacks would encounter time-on-target strikes calculated with wooden slide rules. The tactical balance had shifted permanently in favour of forces equipped with innovations their enemies couldn't identify. Burns's frustration with slow calculations had cascaded into strategic consequences that would determine the outcome of the war in Europe. A National Guard captain who hated horses had accidentally invented the key to defeating Germany's last desperate gamble for survival. The wooden ruler that looked like a simple measuring device had measured the precise dimensions of German military defeat. The story was approaching its climax, but the full implications of this invisible innovation were still unfolding across battlefields where German commanders continued to struggle against firepower they couldn't understand or counter. The final phase of the Ardennes offensive revealed the complete transformation of artillery warfare that Burns's innovation had created. As German forces retreated toward their original positions in late January 1945, their commanders filed reports that would puzzle military analysts for decades. These weren't typical after-action assessments discussing tactical failures or strategic miscalculations. They were testimonies to encountering something that defied their fundamental understanding of how artillery functioned in modern combat. SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division, wrote in his final report that American artillery had achieved supernatural coordination that violated every principle of fire support his officers had learned. German artillery doctrine assumed that concentrated fires required extensive preparation, detailed planning, and sequential execution. The Americans were delivering concentrated fires instantly, without apparent preparation, with devastating accuracy that suggested they possessed intelligence capabilities beyond German comprehension. What Mohnke couldn't understand was that intelligence wasn't the key. Speed was. American forward observers weren't receiving better target information than their German counterparts. They were simply calling for fire that could be calculated and delivered before German forces had time to react. The graphical firing table had eliminated the calculation bottleneck that had limited artillery responsiveness since the invention of indirect fire. The invisibility of this advantage became even more pronounced during the retreat phase. German forces attempting to establish defensive positions found themselves under coordinated artillery fire within minutes of occupying any location. Reconnaissance elements reported American positions to German artillery commanders, who then spent precious minutes calculating firing data using traditional tabular methods. By the time German batteries were ready to fire, American forces had either displaced or called for counter-battery fire that arrived first. This pattern repeated across every engagement during the withdrawal. German artillery, still operating under pre-war calculation methods, couldn't compete with the response times American batteries achieved through their wooden slide rules. The tactical initiative belonged permanently to forces that could coordinate firepower faster than their opponents could coordinate attacks or defensive measures. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, recognized that something fundamental had changed in artillery warfare but couldn't identify what. His intelligence staff produced exhaustive analyses of American equipment, doctrine, and organization. They documented American communication procedures, studied captured fire direction center materials, and interrogated prisoners extensively. Their conclusion was that American artillery superiority resulted from better training and more flexible command structures. They were partially correct but missed the crucial element. Training and command structures mattered, but they were enablers rather than drivers. The real driver was a calculation device so simple that German intelligence officers overlooked it completely when examining captured American positions. Even when they found graphical firing tables among captured equipment, they dismissed them as minor. accessories rather than revolutionary innovations. This intelligence failure had strategic consequences that extended beyond the Ardennes. German defensive planning for subsequent battles assumed that American artillery, while effective, operated within traditional constraints. German commanders allocated time for artillery response, planned movements based on expected fire patterns, and positioned forces according to conventional artillery doctrine. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong when tested against time-on-target capabilities. The Battle of the Rhineland in February and March 1945 demonstrated this pattern on a larger scale. German forces established defensive positions along river lines, expecting to use natural barriers and prepared fortifications to slow American advances. They positioned artillery to deliver pre-planned concentrations on likely crossing sites and approach routes. Their defensive scheme assumed American artillery would require time to register targets, calculate firing data, and coordinate multiple batteries for effective fire support. Instead, American forces crossing the Rhine encountered German defensive fires briefly, before overwhelming German positions with coordinated counter-battery fire that arrived faster than German gunners could adjust or displace. German artillery officers reported that their positions came under accurate fire within minutes of opening fire themselves. Traditional counter-battery techniques, which relied on plotting enemy gun positions and calculating return fire, were too slow against opponents who could deliver coordinated fires immediately. The psychological impact on German artillery crews became a significant factor in combat effectiveness. Gunners who had operated confidently throughout the war began hesitating before firing, knowing that American response would be swift and devastating. Battery commanders started positioning their guns for rapid displacement, rather than optimal firing positions. The entire German artillery system adapted to function under the assumption that any fire mission would draw immediate retaliation. This defensive mindset fundamentally altered German artillery doctrine in ways that reduced its effectiveness even when facing non-American opponents. German batteries engaged British and Canadian forces using the same cautious procedures they had developed against American time-on-target techniques. The innovation that Burns had created to solve American calculation problems was now constraining German operations across the entire Western Front. The cascading effects continued through the final months of the war. German commanders found themselves unable to concentrate forces for counterattacks because any assembly area immediately drew coordinated artillery fire. They couldn't establish artillery positions that remained effective for extended periods because American counter-battery fire arrived too quickly for sustained operations. They couldn't predict American artillery patterns because there were no patterns to predict when all fires arrived simultaneously. By April 1945, German artillery officers were reporting that their American counterparts had achieved capabilities that seemed to transcend normal military limitations. Shells arrived without warning from batteries positioned beyond normal range brackets. Fire missions appeared to originate from positions that German intelligence hadn't identified. Coordinated fires struck targets with precision that suggested supernatural observation capabilities. None of these reports mentioned calculation speed, because German officers couldn't conceive that calculation methods might be the determining factor. Artillery mathematics were artillery mathematics. Every army used the same ballistic principles, the same firing tables, the same basic procedures. The idea that one side might have developed significantly faster calculation methods was outside their conceptual framework. This blind spot persisted even after German forces captured intact American fire direction centers, complete with all equipment and documentation. German artillery specialists examined every piece of equipment, studied every procedure, analyzed every communication protocol. They found standard radios, standard plotting boards, standard meteorological equipment. The graphical firing tables were present, but their significance remained invisible to analysts who assumed calculation methods were universal constants rather than variables that could be innovated. The final irony emerged during post-war interrogations when German artillery officers were shown graphical firing tables and had their function explained. Many expressed amazement that such a simple device could create such decisive tactical advantages. Some admitted they had seen similar devices in captured American positions, but had assumed they were surveying instruments or navigational tools rather than calculation devices that revolutionized fire direction procedures. The invisibility that had protected Burns's innovation during the war became part of its historical legacy. Post-war military analyses focused on American industrial capacity, superior communications, better training programs, and more flexible command structures. All important factors, but none addressing the fundamental calculation advantage that had enabled everything else. The wooden slide rule that had changed artillery warfare remained hidden in the technical details that military historians often overlooked. This pattern of invisible innovation creating visible advantages would repeat throughout subsequent military history. Technologies that seemed minor or obvious often produced disproportionate tactical effects because opponents couldn't identify or counter what they couldn't see. The graphical firing table established a template for how simple solutions to technical problems could cascade into strategic advantages that determined the outcomes of entire campaigns. Burns himself remained unaware of the broader implications of his innovation until decades after the war. He had solved a personal frustration with slow calculations and moved on to other problems. The fact that his solution had contributed to defeating Germany's last major offensive was something he learned from military historians rather than experiencing directly. From his perspective, he had simply made artillery calculations less annoying for fire direction center crews. The disconnect between individual innovation and strategic consequences reflected a broader truth about technological change in military affairs. Revolutionary capabilities often emerge from mundane improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The cumulative effect of many small innovations could transform warfare more completely than any single major development. Burns's wooden slide rule exemplified this principle by creating tactical advantages through improved efficiency rather than increased firepower. Abbot Harrington Burns died in 1994, never knowing that his wooden slide rule had helped save the free world. He lived quietly in Arizona, running his small construction business, never speaking about the device that had revolutionized warfare. The graphical firing table that cost $1.50 at the Fort Sill bookstore had delivered strategic victory against Nazi Germany. Sometimes the most profound innovations hide in plain sight, waiting for someone frustrated enough to spend an evening sketching solutions to problems everyone else accepted as unsolvable.